I have no shortage of capable cameras and lenses for photography, but sometimes it's really nice to purposely limit yourself, to challenge yourself, to learn a little bit more about yourself as a photographer, and to think about what you're doing in your photography. And on that note, I'm going to be taking this guy, a $5 camera I picked up on eBay on a 5-day camping trip to New Mexico and West Texas, with the goal being to take at least one good photo and to learn a little bit more about myself as a photographer. So let's go on that trip together and see what happens. First, a little bit about this camera. It's like a chunky point and shoot, a little awkward in the pocket, too big for that. And I chose it for this experiment for 3 reasons. First, it's cheap. You can grab it for under 10 bucks on eBay any day of the week. Second, Allie covered this camera in great detail on her channel, 1 Month 2 Cameras, and really loved what she got out of it for such a cheap little camera. My first Olympus point and shoot, so that was interesting. And then third, and the real reason I chose this camera is because of this. But we'll talk more about that later. My first opportunity to photograph with this camera came after we set up camp and went on a short hike in Davis Mountain State Park here in Texas. They call it a mountain. Here in Texas, we don't have a lot to go off of, so it's not very big, but I guess it's technically a mountain. In any case, it was beautiful out there. I loved it in that state park. When we went on the hike, the sun was high in the sky, but the kids were cheerful, and that is what determines when and where we go on a hike, not silly stuff like perfect lighting. But I was still impressed with this little camera could do. Now, the camera by default over sharpens your files like crazy. At first, I was looking through the images on the playback thinking, wow, that is super impressive. This lens is super sharp, until I pulled it up on my computer and realized that it was way too sharp. A lot of these pictures are left on that default setting, so that's what you're seeing. It was only later that I learned the hack that Allie talks about in her video, where you set up your own profile and then save that setting each time you reboot to a lower sharpening level. It was also on this hike that we discovered this green smoke emitting mushroom, and that this camera can shoot video. I don't know which is more shocking. Seriously, if you know what this is, let me know. As part of this trip, we planned to visit Balmaria State Park, which is this spring-fed swimming hole, literally an oasis in the middle of the desert. This amazing clear water pool that people snorkel, and you can see fish and turtles down there. Unfortunately, because of recent rains, the water was murky, so I didn't even get to bust out my cool underwater case that I bought for this camera. So this just sat up and took up a big portion of my little Toyota Corolla for the whole trip. But I did get to test it in a pool, our neighborhood pool, a couple weeks prior, and the results are promising. It's kind of a dream of mine ever since I was a little kid looking at these dive cases. I always wanted to own one, but they're always so expensive, and the cameras are expensive too. Nowadays, you can buy one of these old cameras for $5 and one of these cases for 20 bucks any day. So I think that's pretty cool. Back at the campsite, I whipped out this Olympus to try my hand at some food photography. And while there's nothing award-winning here, I appreciate this cheap little camera's lifelike colors and rendering. It was here I played more with the macro mode on the camera and got some real bokeh. Shout out to s'mores, by the way, as being one of the best parts of camping. And my question to those who are not from the United States, do you even know about s'mores? Is that a thing around the world? I don't know. Sunset was approaching fast, and we wanted to see the sunset and see how this camera performed in that nice light, so we drove up to this little overlook. And incredibly, this lens doesn't show any horrible chromatic aberrations to my eye, even in this extreme backlit scenario. So I take back any comments I made about the over sharpening and trying to make up for a lackluster lens here. I'm actually really impressed with this lens at this point. And because I wanted to try out another camera that I brought, because you know me, I don't just bring one camera on a trip, I handed this camera off to my 4-year-old and let her have at it. And that's when I found out she was a better photographer than I am. I mean, she had a few Star Wars reboots in there, but overall, some really cool stuff. And in all seriousness, if all you get out of this video is to buy a $5 old digicam and then hand it to a young person in your life, then my job here is complete. It is fascinating to see what their little minds visualize and grab hold on and then are able to take a picture of. And then unlike this little guy stealing my expensive wildlife camera setup, these cameras are much more inexpensive, and if they break it, that's fine. We woke up early the next morning with surprisingly compliant kids to go catch the sunrise on that same overlook. And the camera had a little difficulty focusing in low light and backlit scenarios, but even some of these out of focus shots are really smooth and pleasant. And I'm slowly learning, thanks to some other photographers who have influenced me, that we shouldn't really overly focus on the technical details of photographs. If we're trying to convey a mood or just some creative expression, then it's okay to break some of those rules. I'm just saying maybe you shouldn't just avoid all that altogether, but maybe embrace the imperfections sometimes and see where that takes you. And then it was on our way back to the car from this little walk down the overlook that I got some of my favorite pictures from the trip. The light was just beautiful coming off of the sunrise, and once again I think the Olympus just nailed the colors straight out of the camera for these. And it was at this point I was feeling pretty good about this little camera and what I was able to get so far, but little did I know that some of my favorite shots were yet to come. From Davis Mountain State Park, we then drove to Guadalupe Mountains National Park to camp there for a few nights. And my kids were understandably worn out from 2 nights of camping and me taking them on hikes, so they didn't want to hike anymore. That was the inspiration for this picture. I call it, Are We There Yet? It was a good chance to try out the flash on the Olympus C740, which turns out is pretty good. I felt like it balanced the scene well, and while it definitely looks like the picture was taken 20 years ago, I kind of like that vibe. And I almost forgot, this camera is called an ultra zoom for a reason. It has a humongous zoom range, 38 millimeters to 380 millimeters equivalent on the long end. I would say that the optical quality degrades quite a bit on the very long end, and certainly it's hard to stabilize a camera that doesn't have any stabilization. But back off the zoom range a little bit and I'd say it captures plenty of detail. While we're in New Mexico, we of course visited Carlsbad Caverns. If you've never been there, it's quite an amazing experience, and especially for those, if you're bringing young kids or people that are just not used to hiking long distances, it's very accessible. You can even get a wheelchair down there. So I think it's kind of a national treasure that way. Definitely recommend visiting. Some of you are not going to like this, but I did not bring this camera. I did not even bother bringing it because my modern smartphone is way better equipped to handle this low light photography. And I have nothing against smartphone photography. I know some people might want me to take a strong stance against smartphones as being illegitimate cameras, but they serve their purpose very well sometimes, and this is one of those. The intelligent stacking inside the camera with night sight meant I could just handhold shots and take pictures of my family inside a low-lit cave, and it did all the processing for me, all the stacking for me, and they look great. Back outside, we went on a short hike, and my daughter stole this camera from me again. And then the batteries died. But that was several hundred pictures off of one set of AA's. So that's pretty good. Did I get the shots I wanted? Yes. Did this camera let me forget about fancy photography and just get back to the basics? Yes. But I think the real lesson I learned here is I just love photography and the process and finding beautiful images and capturing those memories and putting it all together. Whether that's with a $5 camera, a $500 camera, or my smartphone. For $5, this camera is incredible, but you may want to see what $50 could get you in a camera, and for that you'll want to check out this next video. I'll see you over there, and until next time, happy snapping.